The words still echo in my head, even though the plates have long been cleared away. People like that should just be grateful for a plate of food. She said it so casually, so effortlessly cruel, her laughter gliding over the porcelain clink of silverware. For a second, I thought I had misheard her. But when I looked up, the smirk on her face told me I hadn't. The air at that table was too clean, too perfumed. It smelled of money, of rosemary and polished cutlery, of a world that had never known hunger. Her parents sat across from me, straight-backed, their forks poised like little weapons. They didn't look at me directly, only at my frayed jacket sleeve, at the old watch on my wrist that had stopped ticking years ago. My son, my only son, sat beside his wife. He didn't look at me either. His hands trembled as he reached for the gravy boat, pretending to pour, though no one asked for it. I watched the way his jaw tightened. Shame has a sound, you know. It isn't loud. It's the quiet click of a knife against porcelain when you wish the silence would swallow you whole. That night, the candlelight flickered between us, throwing long shadows across the table. I had spent years earning the kind of money that could have bought everything in that room twice over, but in that moment, I felt poorer than I ever had in my life. They thought I was broke. They thought I was desperate. And maybe that was the point. When I decided to visit them for Thanksgiving, I didn't plan it as a test. Or at least, I told myself I didn't. But deep down, I wanted to see who my son had become now that comfort had replaced struggle. 4 years, I had provided for him quietly. I'd paid for his college in cash, sent him the down payment for his first home under another name, even invested in the company where he worked. He thought his promotions came from his own merit. I never told him otherwise. I wanted him to stand proud, not indebted. But somewhere along the way, gratitude turned into distance. The calls became fewer, the visits shorter. Eventually, he stopped asking how I was altogether. Maybe he thought I was fine. Maybe he didn't want to know the truth that I lived modestly, in a small apartment on the edge of town, not because I had to, but because I wanted to remember what simplicity felt like. When his invitation came more out of obligation than affection, I accepted without hesitation. He said, "Dad, come over for dinner. Emily's parents will be there. It'll be good for everyone to meet again." Meet again. The words tasted strange. As if I were a stranger needing introduction to my own blood. I ironed my old brown jacket that morning. The one my wife used to patch at the elbows. It smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Before leaving, I looked in the mirror and wondered whether the man staring back still looked like a father or just another old man carrying too many secrets. When I reached their house, I paused at the door. The windows glowed warm from the inside. Laughter spilling out like music. For a moment, I almost turned back. But then the door opened, and Emily appeared. Her smile froze halfway when she saw me. She masked it quickly, but not quickly enough. "Oh, you made it," she said. Her tone was polite, but her eyes searched the empty space behind me as if hoping someone else might be standing there instead. My son came to the door seconds later. "Dad," he said, his voice caught between surprise and discomfort. "Come in." The house smelled of cinnamon and roasted turkey, the kind of scent that should have felt like home. But everything inside gleamed too perfectly: the marble counters, the spotless glass, the new chandelier. It all screamed of presentation, not warmth. As I stepped in, I could feel the eyes of Emily's parents following me. Her father, a tall man with silver hair and an expensive watch, offered a quick nod. Her mother didn't bother hiding her disdain. She glanced at my shoes, clean but old, and then at her daughter as if to say, "Really? This is him." I took my seat at the table, the far end, near the window. It was deliberate, I'm sure of it, just far enough to exclude me from the center of conversation. At first, they spoke about business, about vacations, about the new car Emily's father had bought. Every topic was a monument to their success. I smiled politely, contributing nothing. I didn't need to. My silence seemed to make them feel better about themselves. Emily's mother leaned forward and said, "So, what do you do these days?" "I'm retired," I replied softly. "Ah," she said, drawing the word out. "That must be difficult." Her tone was syrupy but poisonous underneath. Emily shifted in her seat, her hand resting possessively on my son's arm. "He's always been independent," she said quickly. "We help him when we can, of course." The words stung more than I expected. Help him. As if I were a charity case. My son didn't correct her. He just kept eating, his fork scraping the plate with every bite. That sound metal against porcelain felt louder than their laughter. Then, halfway through dinner, came the moment that split everything open. Emily's father was telling a story about a man who lost his fortune gambling. Everyone laughed. And then Emily, with a glass of wine halfway to her lips, turned to me and said it. People like that should just be grateful for a plate of food. Silence followed. For a second, even the air forgot how to move. My son froze. His eyes flicked toward me but didn't linger. He said nothing. I didn't react. I just looked at her. Not with anger, not even with sadness. Just observation. Because in that instant, I saw everything I needed to know. The woman my son had married wasn't cruel because of who she was cruel because she believed she could be. And my son, my flesh and blood, let her be. The rest of the evening passed like a slow-motion film. Every laugh, every clink of a glass, every polite smile felt rehearsed. I nodded where I should have, thanked them for the meal, even complimented the dessert. But inside, something was shifting. Not rage, not yet. Something quieter. Something colder. When I left their house that night, the air outside felt different. The sky was sharp with winter stars, and I could hear the wind scraping against the trees. I stood on their porch for a long time, breathing it all in, the smell of roasted turkey fading into the dark, the echo of her words bouncing in my skull. Grateful for a plate of food. I had spent decades building a life where gratitude could be given freely, not demanded as pity. And yet, here I was, being told to bow my head at a table I helped pay for, in a house I indirectly built. I walked away slowly, each step measured. The night stretched wide and silent, and I realized something I hadn't wanted to face. My son didn't lose respect for me that night. He had lost it long ago. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window in my small apartment, watching the streetlights flicker over the wet pavement. I poured myself a cup of tea, but it grew cold before I touched it. My thoughts drifted backward to the nights I stayed up late paying bills, to the mornings I walked miles to work so my son could sleep a little longer, to the sacrifices no one saw. I remembered his small hands holding mine the day his mother passed. I promised her I'd make him into a man of honor. And now, all these years later, I couldn't tell whether I had failed her or whether I had simply protected him too well from struggle. Sometimes love spoils quietly. It doesn't rot all at once. It decays in moments of comfort, in the silence after small betrayals. That night, I felt the weight of every unspoken word between us. But something else stirred inside me, too. Resolve. A decision forming at the edges of grief. The next morning, I took out a folder from my drawer, the one marked Estate. Inside were papers, deeds, bank statements. Numbers most people would never believe belonged to a man like me. I stared at them for a long time. It wasn't pride that held me back from sharing my wealth all these years. It was principle. I wanted my son to love me, not my money. To see the man, not the wallet. But now I saw how blindness can be inherited, how wealth given too soon can make a heart poor. So I called my attorney. I told him I wanted to make some changes. He asked what kind. I said, final ones. He didn't ask why. Perhaps he didn't need to. That same day, I began making notes quietly, methodically. I listed every person who had ever treated me with kindness without knowing what I had. The neighbor who brought me soup when I was sick. The young man at the grocery store who insisted on carrying my bags. The janitor who swept my building steps every morning with a smile. And at the top of that list, one name stood out. It wasn't my son's. Before sunset, I sat at my desk, pen in hand, and wrote a single line across the first page of my new will. Kindness, not blood, inherits my legacy. As the ink dried, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The storm had found direction. That night, I whispered to the empty room, "You told me to be grateful for a plate of food. One day, you'll learn what it costs to lose the man who bought the table." The next morning, the sunlight didn't feel warm. It came through the blinds like a confession, thin, cold, and uninvited. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at a cup of tea that had lost its steam, and realized that silence has its own weight. The kind that presses against your chest until even breathing feels like work. Everything around me seemed louder than usual. The clock ticked with an almost mocking precision. The refrigerator hummed like a whisper that refused to stop. Even the street outside, normally so quiet, seemed to carry a distant echo of laughter, the kind that belongs to other people, people who don't live with ghosts. I had been humiliated before in life. I'd been underestimated, ignored, and insulted by strangers who saw only the surface. But never by my own blood. Never by the hands I once held steady as he learned to walk. That night at the dinner table replayed in fragments the glint of Emily's earrings as she tilted her head in amusement, the subtle smile her mother gave her as if rewarding cruelty, the way my son avoided my eyes. I couldn't forget his silence. It wasn't what he said that hurt me, it was what he didn't. As the day went on, I found myself wandering through old boxes I hadn't opened in years. Photographs, letters, school drawings. One caught my eye, my son, 6 years old, covered in mud, holding a wooden toy plane I'd made for him. The smile on his face was pure sunlight. He had no idea then that life would harden him, that love would one day feel conditional. I sat there holding that picture, my thumb tracing the edges, and thought of his mother. She used to say, "Never let him forget where he comes from." I thought I had done that. I thought modest living would teach him gratitude. But maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe by shielding him from hunger, I had starved him of humility. My wife was the anchor in our lives. She grounded everything with quiet grace. When she got sick, I worked double shifts, sometimes triple, to cover her treatments. I'd come home smelling of metal and oil, my hands raw, but she would smile as if my exhaustion was a badge of love. After she passed, I poured everything into my son. I wanted to make her proud. But pride has a strange way of blinding a man. It makes you believe you're building legacy when, in truth, you might just be building distance. I looked around my apartment, a modest one-bedroom tucked behind a laundromat. The air always carried a faint scent of detergent and soap, a reminder that life, at its core, is about cleaning what gets dirty again and again. My furniture was old but comfortable. The table was scratched from years of bills and late-night writing. On the wall hung a faded photo of my wife, framed cheaply but priceless to me. That little home, humble as it was, had peace. No judgment lived there. No competition. No pretense. But even peace can feel like loneliness when love turns cold elsewhere. I walked to the window. Outside, an old man was feeding pigeons near the bus stop. They surrounded him fearlessly, trusting his slow movements. Watching him, I thought, they know who feeds them. They don't bite the hand that gives. Animals understand loyalty better than people. Sometimes. Days passed, and my phone stayed silent. My son didn't call. Emily didn't either. I wasn't surprised. People often avoid guilt by pretending it doesn't exist. They bury discomfort under busyness. On the third day, I finally received a message. It wasn't from him. It was an automated bank alert about the dividends from one of my investments. I stared at the amount. It was enough to change anyone's life. Enough to buy the very house where I'd been treated like a beggar. And yet, that number brought me no joy. It felt like mockery proof that I could buy everything except decency. Money is strange that way. It can't erase the echo of a cruel sentence spoken over dinner. It can't rewrite the silence of a son too ashamed to defend his father. Around noon, a knock came at my door. It was my neighbor, Mrs. Evans, a widow in her 70s who lived 2 floors below. She carried a plate of warm cornbread, her apron dusted with flour. "I made too much," she said with a smile. "You always forget to eat when you're thinking too hard." I laughed softly. "You can tell." She shrugged. "You've got that look." The look of someone replaying a conversation they should have ended differently. I invited her in, and we sat together for a while. She talked about her garden, her late husband, the pigeons on the roof that never left. I barely spoke, but she didn't need me to. Sometimes company doesn't come to fix pain, it just keeps you from drowning in it. Before leaving, she said something that stuck with me. Good men don't need to prove what they're worth. But sometimes the world needs reminding anyway. After she left, I sat there staring at the cornbread. Simple, homemade, given with kindness. No show, no pride. Just care. And I thought that's wealth. Not what's in the account, but what's in the gesture. That evening, memories returned uninvited. The first Thanksgiving after my wife died. My son was still in college. He had insisted I come to his dorm cafeteria for dinner. He'd used his last few dollars to buy a cheap pumpkin pie. We sat on plastic chairs under flickering lights, eating slices that tasted more like cardboard than dessert. But we laughed. We laughed until we cried. He had said, "One day, Dad, I'll make sure you never eat in a place like this again." And he did keep that promise, only he forgot to invite love to the table. That night, I opened my old safe. Inside were papers, business ledgers, trust deeds, a notebook. Each page represented years of sacrifice. Missed vacations, sleepless nights, hard labor. I had built an empire without ever bragging about it. My philosophy was simple. The world doesn't need to know you're powerful. It just needs to know you're good. But sitting there, I wondered if goodness without wisdom is just naivete in disguise. My attorney once told me, "Your silence is your greatest weapon." I never believed him until now. I flipped through the pages, running my fingers over the embossed letterhead of my company's logo. My son didn't even know the name. He had worked for one of our subsidiaries for years, never realizing I was the founder. I had kept it hidden, wanting him to earn his path on merit. But now, that secrecy felt like armor waiting to be used. As midnight neared, I spoke aloud to the quiet room. "You thought I was broke. You thought you were feeding me out of pity." The words didn't carry anger. They carried clarity. I wasn't angry at Emily. Not really. People like her reveal truth faster than mirrors. No, my disappointment was reserved for my son. For his silence. For letting cruelty live unchecked in his home. For forgetting that respect is not a favor, it's a reflection of who you are. I closed the safe gently. The sound of metal clicking shut felt final, like a door sealing between two worlds, the one before that dinner, and the one after. I stepped outside for air. The city was quiet. Leaves rustled under my shoes, and the streetlights buzzed faintly. In the distance, I saw the same old man feeding pigeons. When he noticed me, he smiled. "Cold night," he said. "Yes," I replied. "But colder hearts." He laughed softly, not understanding. Or maybe understanding too well. I walked aimlessly for blocks, passing shuttered stores and glowing windows where families gathered around televisions. Their laughter spilled into the street. It hurt and healed at the same time. Reminded me that life goes on, even when love doesn't. When I finally returned home, I wrote 3 words on a piece of paper. "They've forgotten grace." I pinned it above my desk. I didn't know it then, but that note would become the spark that lit everything that followed. Before I went to bed, I took one last look at the photo of my wife. "You'd know what to do," I whispered. "You always did." And then, like a whisper carried by wind, I heard her voice in my mind. "Remind them who you are. But don't do it with anger. Do it with truth." It wasn't revenge that began to grow in me that night, it was something deeper. A desire to restore balance. To teach, not to destroy. To show my son that humility can't be bought, but it can be lost. I went to sleep with a strange calm, the kind that only comes after deciding not to let pain define you anymore. The next morning, I woke before dawn, made coffee, and looked out the window. The sky was the color of steel. I smiled faintly. The world was about to learn that the man they pitied was the one holding the pen. That writes destinies. Morning came quietly, the way a secret arrives before it's ready to be spoken. The city still slept, the sky half awake and bruised with blue. I sat by the window again, fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. My mind was a storm pretending to be calm. That's how realization often begins, not as fire, but as stillness. I wasn't thinking about revenge. Not yet. I was thinking about silence. The kind that grows in families when truth goes unspoken too long. The kind that eats away at respect until it becomes habit to forget gratitude. Something inside me had shifted after that dinner. It wasn't anger, it was awareness. I had spent decades living quietly, believing that humility was strength. I thought my silence protected love. But now I understood. Silence also protects arrogance. I didn't work that day. I didn't make calls or check my investments. I simply walked. Through the old streets where I used to take my son for ice cream, past the park where he learned to ride his first bike, down to the corner where his mother and I once sat watching the sunset after her final doctor's appointment. The bench was still their chipped paint, initials carved into the wood. Hers were still visible, L+M. I ran my fingers over the grooves, remembering her laughter. She had warned me once years ago about the dangers of unearned comfort. "Love him," she had said, "but let him fall. Let him bruise his pride before it owns him." I hadn't listened. I wanted to shield him from every sharp edge life had. And now those same edges were cutting through me. When I returned home, I sat at my desk and wrote a letter I never intended to send. It began simply. "Son, I remember every time you looked at me with trust. I remember teaching you how to shake a man's hand, how to stand up when you've done wrong, how to look someone in the eye when you speak. But somewhere between then and now, you stopped seeing me as a man and started seeing me as a burden." My hand trembled as I wrote. "You let a stranger insult your father, and you said nothing. That silence told me everything I needed to know." I folded the paper neatly and placed it inside an old envelope. Then I locked it in my desk drawer. That letter wasn't meant for him. It was meant for me to mark the moment I stopped pretending that things would fix themselves. That night, I took a long walk under a sky the color of iron. The streets were empty except for the hum of distant traffic. As I crossed the old bridge near the river, I stopped in the middle and leaned against the railing. The water below moved slow, heavy with reflection. I thought of my wife again, how she used to say that truth is like water. Even if you block its path, it finds a way through. And then it hit me. I had been blocking truth for years. Protecting my son from the knowledge of who I really was. Letting him live a fiction where he was the success story and I was the humble, aging father who should be. Grateful for a plate of food. That line came back again, sharp, echoing, poisonous. Grateful for a plate of food. I whispered to the wind. "You wanted humility, Emily. I'll give you a lesson in it." The decision wasn't born from rage. It was born from precision. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and that whisper becomes the loudest thing in the room. The next morning, I went to my office downtown, a small, nondescript building I'd owned for decades through a holding company. Most of my employees didn't even know who I was. They thought I was an old accountant who came in from time to time to check numbers. That was the beauty of anonymity. It allowed me to observe without interference. When I entered, my assistant, a middle-aged woman named Clara, looked surprised. "Mr. L, we didn't expect you today." I smiled faintly. "Just a few updates to make." I went straight to my private office. The air inside smelled of paper and quiet success. On the desk lay rows of files, projects, acquisitions, trust records. Each one represented years of patience. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. "Robert," I said, "it's time." He hesitated. "Time for what exactly?" "For the truth," I replied. Later that afternoon, my son called. His voice was uncertain, hesitant. "Dad, hey." Emily felt bad about dinner. We shouldn't have said well, she shouldn't have said what she did. "Don't apologize for her," I said quietly. He paused. "I just don't want this to turn into something bigger. We were all drinking, emotions were weird. You know how family can be." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Yes," I said. "I know exactly how family can be." He sighed. "Look, we want you to come by next week. Maybe talk things through." "Of course," I said softly. "I'll bring something with me." When he hung up, I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes. That single sentence I had spoken, "I'll bring something with me," carried the weight of a storm he didn't yet know was coming. For the next few days, I prepared. Slowly, methodically. I didn't rush because true justice should never be rushed, it should be crafted. I reviewed my estate documents again. The lawyer came by, and we spent hours revising clauses, rewriting terms, securing witnesses. When we finished, I looked at him and said, "No one gets a single cent unless they've shown me respect without expecting reward." He nodded, tapping his pen. "It's poetic, really." I smiled. "No. It's overdue." As he left, I looked out the window. The city lights reflected off the glass, 1,000 small suns blinking in unison. For the first time in years, I felt awake. That night, I dreamed of my wife again. She stood in the kitchen of our old home, folding a napkin, humming softly. When she looked up, her eyes were kind but sad. "You're doing what I couldn't," she said. "You're teaching him again." I reached for her hand, but before I could touch it, she faded like smoke. I woke with tears drying on my cheeks. The first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, painting the room in gold and shadow. I whispered, "I'm not doing this to hurt him. I'm doing it to wake him up." But deep down, I knew that sometimes awakening hurts more than punishment. On Sunday, I drove past my son's neighborhood. Their house looked immaculate from the outside, fresh paint, trimmed hedges, 2 luxury cars parked perfectly in the driveway. Perfection always has a price. I parked across the street and watched for a while. Emily came out holding their small dog, laughing into her phone. My son followed a minute later, wearing a tailored jacket, rushing to open the car door for her. They looked happy, comfortable, untouchable. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if I was being too harsh. But then I remembered her words again, the sound of her laugh as she said them, and the hesitation in my son's eyes as he chose silence over dignity. No. This wasn't cruelty. This was consequence. When I returned home, I took out the old letter I had written to my son and read it again. Then I tore it in half. I didn't need to explain myself in words anymore. I would let actions speak, the kind of actions that couldn't be undone, rewritten, or excused as misunderstanding. I poured myself a glass of water, took a slow sip, and looked around my apartment one last time. Everything in it was simple, grounded, and honest, just like the man I used to be before I let others define my worth. That was the moment I decided. The world that pitted me would learn that humility and power can live in the same body. Justice, I realized, isn't about revenge. It's about restoration. And I was ready to restore balance. I took out my notebook and wrote the first line of my plan. Show them what gratitude truly costs. The stage was set. The dinner had planted the seed. The silence had watered it. Now it was time for it to grow. The next weeks were quieter than battle, but louder than prayer. Planning doesn't look like drama. It looks like patience. It looks like calendars, phone calls, and the steady copy of your own handwriting in the margins of legal documents. It looks like choosing the right moment to move a chess piece so the opponent thinks it was his idea all along. I began with facts. Not feelings. Not fury. Facts. I called Robert, my lawyer, and we met in his office, a small room with tall shelves of leather-bound books and the smell of old coffee. He pushed a cup toward me without asking. "You sure this is what you want?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "But not for revenge. For truth." He folded his hands. "You know, once we file these amendments, they will be hard to reverse." He spoke like a man handling a fragile object. "We will need witnesses, notarization, and some airtight conditions." "Do it," I said. We spent that afternoon rewriting clauses. We crafted language that was precise and unromantic. I wanted no loopholes. I wanted the document to read like a mirror, clear, impossible to dispute, and impossible to ignore. Clause 1. Primary heirs changed. Not a single cent to anyone who had publicly insulted or shown contempt for me in a way documented by witnesses. Clause 2. A substantial portion to be placed in a charitable trust administered by a board of my choosing. Board to include neighbors, long-term employees, and a public notary. Recipients to be those who had shown consistent, undocumented kindness. Clause 3. A discretionary fund for the unnoticed good people who helped without seeking reward. My son would only regain a portion if he could demonstrate, over a 2-year period, genuine, sustained acts of service and humility, verified by independent testimonies. It read almost clinical on paper, but it had teeth. When Robert left, he said gently, "This will sting. Not for you, for them." "Let it sting," I replied. "Maybe they need it to feel what others felt." I did not want the affair to be private. Secrets stay secret. Justice without witnesses is easy to forget. So I made another choice. The revelation would be public. Not a spectacle. Not cruelty for attention. I wanted it to be undeniable, documented, and instructive. I wanted people to remember how small words at a table can cascade into consequences years later. I started with small tests. A spy of my own, not to entrap but to observe. First test, the grocery clerk who always helped me carry my bags. He was young, his jacket sometimes stained with oil from his shift at the garage. I told him I needed help loading a few heavy boxes into my car one afternoon. He came without hesitation, muttered about a late shift, smiled like kindness had its own rhythm. Afterward, I slipped him a note. "Would you allow me to repay you with a job at our company? There are positions in the maintenance crew I'd like you to fill." He looked stunned, then grateful, then ashamed for being stunned, all in the space of a breath. Second test. Mrs. Evans, my neighbor. I asked her to help me with a letter to the community center. She agreed. When the center director arrived for coffee later, I watched how he greeted her with warmth and respect. She never asked for anything in return. Her name went on my list again. Third test. A young janitor named Luis who cleaned the lobby of my building. I watched him one morning, bending to pick up a crumpled receipt and smiling at an elderly tenant as if it were the most natural thing in the world. A week later I offered him an apprenticeship through a foundation I was funding. He cried. I thought of the many hands like his that never get noticed. These acts were not performances. They were seeds. I watered them. But plans require more than goodwill. They need timing. There was a date I kept returning to Thanksgiving. It mattered because that dinner had been the splinter. It mattered because the memory of that night still had power. I decided to reclaim the night, to turn it into a lesson rather than a wound. Told Robert the first wanted the will reading to be attended by family, not private, and to be read publicly at my apartment, then filed and published. He raised an eyebrow. "We can't force anyone to attend," he said. "But we can create conditions that make attendance meaningful." So we wrote a clause. A modest discretionary grant would be made to family members who attended and participated in a mediation session I would call. That would bring them in without coercion. If they arrived, they would be present. If they refused, their absence would speak. I also arranged quietly for a reputable mediator, a woman named Claire who had years of experience with family disputes and, more importantly, with people who thought power gave them permission to hurt. I hired a videographer under the pretext of documenting my philanthropic work. The videographer would capture the reading, not to humiliate, but to make the truth visible. I told Clara, my assistant, what I intended. She blinked, surprised. "Are you sure you want to put this out there?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I want to show how people act when truth is in the room." She nodded slowly. "I'll make the arrangements." Between the legal work and the arrangements, there were practical obstacles. Banks needed new signatories. Trustees had to be confirmed. The charity needed registration documents. Each small delay was a test of patience. Patience was a new muscle for me. It had atrophied under decades of giving away answers and picking fights with injustice directly. There were setbacks. One afternoon a bank clerk misfiled a document, and it took a week to find it. Another time, a trustee I had chosen declined, citing health reasons. That last one stung. I wanted allies who would stand when the dust settled. I replaced him with a retired schoolteacher named Maria who had taught at the corner school for 40 years. She had a laugh like rain and a spine like oak. She accepted without hesitation. Another setback. A rumor. News travels fast where families are concerned. Someone leaked that I had suddenly changed my will. I received a call from an old friend who said he had heard the scuttlebutt. "Why would you do that?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "You've always been quiet." "Because quiet is sometimes the loudest betrayal," I said. That night, Emily called my son in my presence. She called to complain that a distant cousin had texted her about the will. She sounded rattled but also played the offended daughter. I could hear the brittle edge in her voice when she said, "It's none of our business, is it? People like him always make a show." Her tone confirmed one thing. She believed I was performing. She thought all this was theater. She did not understand that theater can be truth too. I rehearsed conversations in my head. I walked through the possible outcomes as a general studies a battle map. What if my son begged? What if he railed? What if he tried to buy his way back? I prepared responses that were not cruel but unwavering. Actions matter more than apologies, I planned to say. Consistency matters more than promises. There was a midnight walk where doubt rose like tide. When you set justice into motion, you risk becoming the very thing you disdain. I remember stopping under a street lamp and balancing possibility against consequence. I thought of turning the whole plan over, letting them keep everything, living another decade in silence and dignity. There was comfort in that idea. But comfort is easy to mistake for cowardice. I chose courage. Small victories arrived like mail. Clara informed me the mediator had confirmed the date. Luis accepted the apprenticeship. Tom's eyes filled with gratitude the first day he stepped into the maintenance shop. Mrs. Evans agreed to be at the reading and promised to bring cornbread. There were also moments that felt like tests directed back at me. My son, maybe sensing something, visited my apartment unannounced. He sat at my table, stirring his coffee, not meeting my eyes. "Dad," he said, voice soft, "I heard something. Is everything okay?" I met his gaze then. I could have told him everything, how I had given him chances he never knew about, how I had funded his degrees and his first house, but I chose to say this instead: I am fine. Sometimes truth is a slow reveal. I wanted him to see me, not his reflection of me. He hesitated, fingers fidgeting with the rim of his cup. We can talk this out. Emily feels terrible about what she said. She said it, I replied. You didn't stop her. He flinched as if my words were a cold draft. I know. I messed up. Then start fixing it, I said. Not with words. He left without another argument. That felt like both failure and promise. As the date approached, neighbors and old friends began to gather gently. Not out of curiosity alone, but out of a sense that something true was unfolding. In the community center, people whispered not of scandal but of character. Maria, the teacher, organized a space for people to speak about acts of kindness they had seen. Clara printed small booklets listing the charitable causes that would be supported by the trust one was establishing. I found that planning justice is not merely a legal exercise. It is also a moral education. It teaches those who watch that consequences follow words, and that dignity is not guaranteed by blood alone. The evening before the reading, I made a final list. Names to thank in private. Names to call if I needed witnesses. The candles in my apartment burned low. I folded the documents and placed them in a leather folio. The pages felt heavier than paper. I slept poorly, not from nerves but from the weight of truth waiting to be carried out. On the morning of the reading, the city felt different, as if it had been holding its breath without telling me. I woke and made coffee with the steady motions of habit. Outside, there was the sound of a newspaper landing on a doorstep, the distant murmur of a radio, a dog barking somewhere down the block. Ordinary noises, the soundtrack of lives continuing. I dressed carefully. Not in the jacket I had worn that night at their house, but in one that had seen better days and was clean. It showed neither wealth nor poverty. It showed presence. As I locked my door, I thought of the phrase I had written earlier, "They've forgotten grace." I added, silently, a new clause to the thought: grace forgotten must sometimes be taught again. I walked to the center with my folio under my arm, feeling the world around me assembling like a scene in which every player would have to decide which role to play. Everything was ready. When everyone arrived that evening, the air in my apartment changed. It smelled of fresh bread, coffee, and anticipation, an odd trinity that belonged to neither celebration nor mourning. I had opened the windows to let the late autumn chill drift through. The curtains moved as though the room itself were breathing. My son came first. He wore the same jacket he always wore to meetings, dark and pressed, the kind that said he was still performing. Emily followed, perfume first, apology second. Her parents came behind them, talking in low voices about parking. A few neighbors already sat quietly on the side chairs, Mrs. Evans with a plate of cornbread, Tom in a clean shirt, Louise looking nervous but proud. Robert, my lawyer, stood near the table with the folio, waiting. I gestured toward the chairs. Please, sit. No one spoke for a moment. The only sound was the creak of wood as they obeyed. I had chosen this room on purpose. The lighting was soft, not dramatic. The walls carried photos of ordinary days, my wife smiling with flour on her face, my son as a boy holding the wooden plane, a picture of the park bench. Nothing rich, nothing poor, just human. The videographer's camera sat quietly in the corner, its red light blinking once, then still. It felt like a heartbeat keeping time. Robert cleared his throat. We're gathered for a formal reading of Mr. L's final estate directives and charitable allocations. This is not a will in the sense of death. It is a living document, effective immediately. Emily frowned. Effective immediately? Robert nodded. By law, yes. Mr. L has chosen to reorganize all holdings into trusts and foundations. He wishes you to understand the reasoning firsthand. My son looked at me, his expression a mixture of confusion and dread. Dad, what's going on? I rose slowly. My voice felt steady, lower than usual. You remember that dinner, I said. Emily stiffened. I said something I shouldn't have, she murmured. You said, people like that should just be grateful for a plate of food. I've thought about those words. I brought you here so we can discuss gratitude. Her father shifted uncomfortably. Her mother whispered, This isn't necessary. It is, I said. Because gratitude without respect is just pity wearing perfume. Robert handed me the folder. I opened it and read. Clause 1, I began. All direct ownerships and liquid assets are transferred to the L Foundation, dedicated to education, housing, and small business grants for those who demonstrate kindness without expectation. The trustees are Mrs. Evans, Mr. Luis Torres, and Mr. Thomas Reed. Emily blinked. Who? I smiled gently. My neighbors and friends. They carried boxes, baked bread, cleaned halls, and spoke with decency. Their names you never learned. She opened her mouth, closed it again. Clause 2, I continued. A restoration clause permits family participation if they complete 2 consecutive years of volunteer service verified by the Foundation. Only then may they receive any stipend. My son exhaled sharply. Dad, this is insane. No, I said. It's instruction. Robert read the legal phrasing, each word measured. The sound filled the room like slow rain. When he finished, silence returned, heavy and intimate. Emily's father stood. You're humiliating them. I'm educating them, I said. There's a difference. I am not punishing my family for wealth. I am reminding them that wealth without heart is debt. Emily whispered, You're cruel. I looked at her gently. Cruel was pretending I was invisible at your table. My son's eyes shimmered. Dad, please. You've made your point. I haven't, I said. You think money is the point. It never was. The point was seeing who you become when you think no one is watching. He swallowed hard. I'm sorry. I walked toward him. I believe you are. But apologies don't build character. Actions do. If you want to change this outcome, you can. It's all written there. He looked at the document as though it were a mirror showing someone he hadn't met yet. I turned toward the others in the room. For those of you who came without knowing why, thank you. You remind me what community looks like. Tonight is not about money. It's about measure. I was measured by arrogance at a table where I was told to be grateful. Tonight, I measure gratitude differently. Mrs. Evans wiped a tear. Luis lowered his head, whispering a prayer in Spanish. Tom stood awkwardly, then clapped once, softly, out of respect. No one else moved. After the reading, I invited everyone to share a meal. The smell of cornbread mingled with stew. Emily hesitated before sitting. My son helped serve bowls without being asked. It was a small gesture, but something shifted in the air, the beginning of humility, perhaps. Robert leaned toward me and whispered, It worked. Not yet, I said. This is only the first lesson. When they left, my apartment was quiet again. Plates stacked, candles burned low. My son lingered by the door. I'll try, Dad, he said softly. I know, I replied. And I'll be watching, not your wallet, your hands. He nodded, eyes wet, and stepped into the hall. I turned off the lights one by one. Outside, the city was a field of small glimmers. Each window a life. Each life a chance to choose decency. Tomorrow, the video would go to the notary and be archived. It wasn't for the internet or gossip. It was for history, the private kind, written between fathers and sons, between words and deeds. Weeks passed, and silence became my ally again. Only this time, it wasn't heavy, it was earned. I no longer carried the ache of humiliation, only the calm that follows truth once it's spoken. The foundation began its work quietly. Luis supervised repairs at the community center. Tom managed deliveries for the new outreach kitchen. Mrs. Evans baked bread twice a week for the volunteers. They never asked how much they were being paid. They only asked what more they could do. My son visited often. At first, he came with guilt, the kind that still needs to explain itself. But as days turned to weeks, he stopped talking about money. He started talking about people. About a boy at the shelter who reminded him of his childhood. About an old woman who wept when he helped fix her roof. He said, "It feels good to do something that doesn't come with a receipt." That was when I knew the lesson had taken root. Emily came once, unannounced. She brought a pie, store-bought but warm, her eyes tired in a way pride can't disguise. She stood in my doorway and said, "I didn't know what it meant to be poor. I think I still don't. But I understand shame now, the right kind, the kind that makes you want to be better." I nodded and invited her in. We ate in silence. No judgment, no sermon. Just two people trying to meet in the middle of what they had broken. When she left, she turned at the door and whispered, "Thank you for not hating me." "I never hated you," I said. "I just waited for you to see." Months later, I walked by their house again. The gate was open, children's laughter spilled into the yard, and the smell of stew drifted into the street. Emily was kneeling in the garden, dirt on her hands. My son saw me, waved, and without hesitation called out, "Come eat with us." This time, the invitation was real. At that table, there was no silver shine of arrogance, no conversation about cars or careers. Just warmth. Just family. When my son filled my plate, he didn't do it out of pity or debt, he did it out of love. I realized then that justice isn't revenge. It's restoration. Revenge closes doors. Justice opens them quietly and waits for others to walk through. As the evening faded, I stood to leave. My son hugged me tightly, the way he did when he was small. "You were right," he whispered. "We forgot grace." I smiled. "Now you remember." I walked home under a sky thick with stars. For the first time in years, I felt light, like I had given something back to the world that money never could. When I reached my door, I turned once more toward the heavens and whispered, "She'd be proud of us." And somewhere in the quiet, I swore I heard her laughter again. What would you have done in my place? Comment below, like this video, and subscribe for more stories.